There are moments in human history when, just by looking back, we realize we have walked alongside a creature more remarkable than any general or king, the dog. Not because they are cute, but because they have accompanied humans through freezing cold, wars, famine, and even the turning points that shape the civilization we have today. And before we step into tonight's story, a story that is warm, wild, and full of surprises, if you find this journey of exploring history through storytelling captivating, please hit subscribe and turn on the bell. It helps me stay motivated to continue bringing you historical stories that you won't find in textbooks. Leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from and whether it's a quiet night or a sunny morning where you are. Now, create a cozy corner for yourself. Dim the lights, let the sound of a fan or rain play in the background, and let's open the door to an extraordinary journey with the friend who has accompanied us for tens of thousands of years. If you want to understand how dogs entered our lives, you have to go back to a world that no one would want to live through twice. An era where the cold wind cut into flesh as if nature were testing how long you could endure before freezing to death. A time when survival was not an inspiring story, but a long chain of bad decisions made under even worse circumstances. Yet it was in that brutal environment, amid the howling wind through ice forests and endless nights without a shred of warmth, that one of the strangest collaborations in history ignited between humans and an animal that, until then, had only appeared in nightmares. Humans of that time were not the heroes we often imagine. They were tired, hungry, and sometimes had to rely on daring acts to extend another day of life. They kindled fires with trembling hands, wrapped themselves in heavy, stinking animal hides, and tried to appear strong in front of things that terrified them. Yet the irony was that this very fragility made them an invaluable resource for the creatures living on the edge of their world, the weak, scrappy wolves that the pack hardly noticed. These weak wolves were not the cold-blooded warriors of comic books. They did not glide through the dark like perfect assassins. On the contrary, they were clumsy individuals, their breath reeking of desperation, and their eyes wide not from bloodlust, but from trying to gauge whether a single step forward would get them eaten. They were cast out of the pack, not because they were too weak to hunt, but because they were too odd to fit the lifestyle of a real wolf pack. It was these outcasts who became the main players in this evolutionary revolution. From the edge of the shadows, they watched humans roasting overcooked pieces of meat, discarding things even the hungry would shake their heads at. To humans, it was trash. To wolves, it was a five-star buffet. And it was the half-burnt, half-raw aroma that drew them closer, inch by inch. Not out of trust, but because hungry stomachs gave the orders. And humans, they were not romantic about this either. If tossing a bone could keep them from being eaten, they would do it immediately. No one in the camp wanted to be the main course for a desperate wolf. Thus, a vague agreement formed, unspoken, without collective memory, without contract, just a temporary compromise to prolong life. Wolves received food, humans received a safe distance, and no one died. At least that night. What no one expected was that this temporary bond repeated itself, as if fate patiently nudged the two species closer with each long night. Day after day, the least aggressive wolves kept returning. Less wild, less prone to random attacks, less likely to view humans as a meal opportunity. And they learned that being less frightening brought more food. Evolution is excellent at turning behavior into form. A lightly wagging tail became the first sign of letting it slide. Wide open eyes no longer signaled warning but resembled pleading. These expressions, whether intentional or not, were rewarded with bones, fat, and sometimes pieces of meat humans didn't want because it wasn't tasty. Gradually, the wolves lingering around the camp changed with each generation. They became smaller, less sharp, less combative, and increasingly suited to life near humans. This was not a magical moment of domestication. It was centuries of the most manageable individuals surviving and passing on their genes. And gradually, the chaotic instincts of wild wolves were replaced by what we today call cute temperament. Humans changed just as much. They realized there was a creature ready to bark into the night when something suspicious occurred. A creature that could follow prey tracks even without understanding it was helping. a creature that lay beside the fire, reducing loneliness on nights when even the wind sounded like crying. Each small contribution, even an unexpected bark, became an important part of the survival strategy. Gradually, what no one anticipated happened. Their presence brought a sense of safety. Not absolute safety, but the kind that allowed humans to sleep more soundly, knowing another pair of ears was listening alongside them. Humans began selecting the friendliest, safest, cutest wolves, keeping them close, protecting them from cold and other predators. A reciprocal relationship was born, not from kindness, but from convenience. Yet from that convenience, something more magical blossomed: trust, something no predator had ever given humans before. And over the years, from creatures on the edge of the light, they stepped fully into the human circle. No longer camp wolves, no longer failed wolves. They became a new species, the primitive dog, ancestors of the hundreds of dog breeds we love today. A strange collaboration built from fear, hunger, and accidental cuteness became the foundation of a friendship lasting tens of thousands of years. When society emerged from the Ice Age and humans stopped considering freezing to death the most common cause of death, the world became more crowded, warmer, and noisier. But one thing remained consistent through the ages: the sound of dogs. From the windswept fields to the first dusty, human smelling cities, barking became the unofficial soundtrack of humanity. Not relaxing music, though, more like an unexpected symphony at 3 a.m. that makes everyone jump up to see if someone is being hunted or if it's just a drifting leaf. The funny thing is, although humans have complained about barking since ancient times, they also began to realize that the noise was actually priceless. Because when dogs barked, it meant they were paying attention. And when they paid attention, it meant humans no longer had to face the darkness alone. No longer were they awakened from peaceful sleep by vague fear. Now there was a four-legged danger detection machine with a heart full of passion and a brain sometimes ruled by whims, yet still the most reliable thing humans had ever possessed. This may sound ordinary to us, but for early communities, it was a real evolutionary boost. Suddenly, there was a creature patrolling the camp like an overworked guard, asking for no salary, only leftover food. It was the best deal in human history, even though no one remembered ever signing the contract. The closer dogs lived to humans, the more abilities they revealed that made humans exclaim, "Oh, we really do need them." Their sense of smell could detect prey from afar as if equipped with an innate radar. Their ears could twitch at sounds humans didn't even notice. They could distinguish a branch breaking in the wind from an approaching animal intent on turning someone into dinner. Of course, they were not perfect warriors. When faced with real danger, most dogs chose the brave option: bark loudly, then hide behind their owner. But this combination, alert first, then retreat immediately, was an extremely effective survival strategy. Humans began to see clearly that there were things they could not do as well as dogs, and vice versa. Dogs could not hunt in an organized way like humans. The point was that each filled the gaps of the other. Gradually, the relationship between humans and dogs entered a more subtle phase. At first, it was just feeding them to avoid being bitten. Then it became feed them because they're cute, then feed them because they help me survive. But then one day, no one knew exactly when, humans realized they began to feel guilty if they didn't share with the dogs. This was no longer a survival agreement. This was the seed of affection, and affection is dangerous. Affection makes humans make irrational decisions. It makes them tolerate strange behaviors: stealing food, destroying things, barking into the dark, running after every moving object. Yet they forgave, even laughed. Because in a world full of uncertainty, having a creature delighted just because you returned from fetching water was too precious. Early nomadic communities witnessed the strangest thing. Dogs not only assisted them in hunting, but also helped humans understand the environment faster. They contributed to driving hunt strategies, where the group, humans and dogs, would herd prey through valleys and ravines. Humans had strategy, dogs had speed. Humans had spears. Dogs had endless enthusiasm and occasionally capricious minds. But that capriciousness sometimes made the prey run exactly into where humans lay in ambush. A wonderfully accidental precision. More importantly, facing danger together built a bond that could not be explained in text. When the two species ran for their lives to avoid being trampled by mammoths, shivered together on a hilltop surveying the battlefield, and sighed in relief at still being alive, something profound was formed. Something not belonging to biology or sociology. Something like, from now on, I watch your back, you watch mine. That bond went further as the climate changed and humans began settling longer in one place. From primitive tents to mud houses, dogs followed as part of the family, sometimes the rowdiest part. They started inserting themselves into chores in very messy ways, pulling meat from baskets, chewing fire sticks, or stealing bones from crying children. But no one truly drove them away, not due to a lack of discipline, but because the presence of dogs made everything less lonely and less grim. Humans of that time had no TikTok, no comedies, no inside jokes, but they had dogs. A natural comedy machine, not trying to be funny yet always succeeding beyond expectation. Dogs rolled in mud, then ran into tents. Dogs snored like thunder. Dogs chased their own shadows. And just like that, long days filled with survival worries became lighter. That was when humans began telling stories about dogs, not as animals, but as characters, souls with their own personalities, comrades with strange loyalty, creatures that made humans feel they were not alone in a vast and frightening world. And so, even before agriculture, before the wheel, before writing, humans possessed something that every later civilization would envy: a true friend, a four-legged friend, noisy, mischievous, but always standing by humans through darkness and dawn. When ancient civilizations began entering an era of wealth and showiness, dogs quickly realized they had stepped into a strange phase of human history. This was a time when humans no longer just wanted to survive. They wanted the whole world to know that they were surviving better than everyone else. And nothing says I am superior to you better than parading around a small, sleek-haired creature, pampered to the point it no longer knows how to survive. If dogs were once comrades, allies in survival, they now became symbols of lifestyle. In Athens, where philosophers were nearly as numerous as water wells and everyone had an opinion on everything, dogs were suddenly pulled into the status race. The nobility decided that having a tiny dog, one that licked guests' faces and slept on imported wool cushions, was a sign of civilization. White-walled houses, marble-paved courtyards, and tables laden with fresh grapes were now complemented by the click-clack of a fancy dog's paws, often given an overly serious name for a 25-centimeter creature. No one truly believed these dogs did anything other than pose, but that was the point. Humans boasted that their dogs didn't need to work. This change did not happen overnight. It began when the wealthy wanted to distinguish themselves from the working class, those who had dogs only for protection, hunting, or guarding livestock. The elite wanted something that demonstrated they had risen above those crude needs. So they chose dogs that could not herd sheep, could not fight, could not catch rabbits, sometimes couldn't even jump onto a doorstep, but had glossy coats and knew how to attract attention. Um, some dog breeds appeared solely for that purpose, to prove their owners had time to groom them daily and enough servants to clean up after them when they expressed their emotions on expensive furniture. Meanwhile, in the East, Persian and Indian palaces also began to favor luxury. Kings and nobles did not just use dogs for war or hunting. They adorned them with golden collars, placed them on small carriages, and even had them sit beside them during court sessions. There are stories of an Indian prince holding a grand ceremony solely to name his pet dog. Of course, scholars are unsure if this story is true, but given how humans pampered pets at the time, it could very well have happened. Even in societies where practicality was paramount, such as Central Asia or Anatolia, wealthy owners began clearly distinguishing between working dogs and pleasure dogs. Working dogs were muscular, hardy in cold and hunger, guarding livestock from wolf packs and sometimes thieves. Pleasure dogs, however, were a different breed. Small, frequently bathed more than their owners, and living so luxuriously that even servants were envious. But this shift did not come solely from vanity. Humans were changing, and the world they built changed along with them. As cities prospered, as trade brought wealth, and as powerful families wanted to stand out, dogs became the perfect choice as a living accessory. They were small enough to carry, cute enough to draw attention, and most importantly, never argued back. They were the complete opposite of philosophers or politicians, and sometimes that was precisely the point. Yet, even in the era when dogs were used like jewelry, the emotional bond between humans and dogs remained strong in a way money could not explain. Some families kept lapdogs but cared for them like children. The wealthy provided them with their own fireplaces, like fed them roasted meat, and sometimes even wrote long poems to commemorate them after death. This was especially common in later Roman families who inscribed affectionate lines on pet tombstones, something they rarely did for humans. During this period, dogs also began to develop social personalities. They no longer lived apart or in packs like wolf ancestors, but developed an entirely new behavior, becoming the center of attention. They learned to read human emotions so well that Greek philosophers were astonished. They knew when their owners were happy, sad, angry, or in need of companionship without being asked. In many places, people believed dogs had intuition, that they saw what humans could not, felt what humans could not feel. And although modern science does not support that view, a dog's sensitivity to human emotions is undeniable in any civilization. Another interesting point, because they appeared everywhere and traveled with merchants from continent to continent, dogs inadvertently became the first diplomats. People could argue over philosophy, religion, or territory, but no one argued, oh, this dog is cute. A favored diplomatic gift at the time was a beautiful small dog, or conversely, a strong large dog for guarding. And so, through each gift, each exchange, each meeting along the Silk Road, dog breeds spread like walking stories. As cities became extremely wealthy, as the nobility flaunted jewelry and houses, dogs played a quiet yet profound role. They reminded humans that true wealth did not come from possessions, but from connection. Lapdogs in palaces could be pampered to absurd extremes, yet they still loved their owners in ways no servant ever did. And the wealthy, surrounded by ritual and politics, discovered that a small creature could make them laugh and feel unconditional love. That is what made dogs a special status symbol, not just signaling wealth, but signaling a desire to be loved, to have companionship, something humans, whether rich or poor, needed equally. And so, in an era where everything could be bought with gold or power, dogs quietly proved a truth. Their real value did not lie in beauty or rarity, but in the affection they gave without negotiation. Throughout the evolutionary journey of humanity, no animal has entered our history as naturally, as ceremoniously, and as chaotically as the dog. Before they became creatures sprawled on sofas, startled by the crinkle of a snack wrapper, they were strategic partners, literally, of humans. And each era assigned them a completely different role. Sometimes a symbol of power, sometimes a companion, sometimes an alarm system, and at other times, nothing more than a source of personal entertainment for the wealthy. To understand how dogs became man's best friend, we must understand how humans continually redefine them to suit their own social needs. In the early days between humans and wolves, the relationship was simply a survival agreement. Humans had fire, meat, and planning brains. Wolves had speed, scent, and the ability to detect danger before humans understood what was happening. Both sides exploited each other in the best way possible, as in any cooperation in human history. However, over time, the wolves that chose to stay close to humans were not the most aggressive, but the calmest, least panicked when they saw the campfire's light, and most importantly, patient enough to watch humans roast meat without lunging for a bite. Those cute ones, by Stone Age standards, were the true ancestors of the dog. When humans began settling, building villages, farming, and herding, the role of dogs expanded according to society's needs. From merely signaling danger, they became actual colleagues, guarding livestock from predators, watching over the area around homes, and sometimes serving as rare sources of comfort during the long, endless winter nights. But what made dogs remarkable was not their skill, but their almost absurd adaptability to every human lifestyle. As society advanced a bit further, dogs didn't just work, they began to become symbols. The first civilizations quickly realized that owning a dog not only provided practical benefits, but also created an image. A powerful lord with a large dog at his side would be seen as stronger, more trustworthy, and seemingly aware of what he was doing, even when the reality was completely opposite. And then a strange trend emerged. The richer the elite, the more they wanted to separate themselves from practical needs. If laborers needed dogs to protect property, the wealthy kept dogs to show they had nothing to worry about. While commoners' dogs had to run through the village, maintaining minimal order, the nobles' dogs were sometimes trained in only one skill: to look worthy of appearing in a painting hung in the parlor. But from here, an interesting split occurred: the distinction between working dogs and dogs for comfortable living. In expanding cities, people often relied on dogs as the last line of defense against chaos, theft, disease, wild animals. Dogs became the eyes and ears of the neighborhood, present in every alley, sometimes the only thing preventing a peaceful night from turning into disaster. Conversely, in mansions and castles, dogs appeared as aesthetic dots, a lively part of the decor softening the opulence. And between these two worlds were all the quirky variations of breeding, selection, and training heavily influenced by humans. From dogs pampered more than children to dogs selectively bred for generations simply to fit the length of a sleeve. As society entered the Middle Ages, social stratification made the contrasting roles of dogs even clearer. For peasants, struggling to survive amid disease, taxes, crop failures, and arbitrary laws, dogs were not pets. They were security solutions, early warning systems, sources of warmth in winter, and sometimes the only companions for a lifetime of labor. These dogs lacked elegant appearance, were not fed lavishly, and were rarely given fancy names. Yet they were the silent pillars of rural life, attached to humans with a simple affection that no symbol of power could buy. Meanwhile, in castles, where power was determined by relations, intrigue, and lavish feasts, dogs were assigned entirely different roles. They were living accessories for the wealthy, symbols of sophistication, companions on hunts, and sometimes the best listeners in the entire palace. But what made dogs endearing, despite the surrounding luxury, was their enduring innocence. No matter how pampered, they were still ready to cause mischief, chase chickens, flout social rules, and remind humans that life was not just about ceremony and power, but also very natural moments. Then, when Europe entered a period of profound change, with the Renaissance, the explosion of knowledge, and cultural reforms, dogs also entered a new era. From symbols of power and labor, they became symbols of emotional attachment. Families began to view them as true members. Philosophers acknowledged their role in social life. Artists included them in paintings not only for style, but also for meaning. Dogs, once tools, symbols, or class accessories, now became bridges between humans and the natural world, and reminders that loyalty sometimes stems from the simplest of things. If the Renaissance gave dogs the opportunity to step into paintings and noble carriages, the next chapter in the story opened onto an entirely different stage: Europe's transition to new centers of knowledge, where the concept of understanding began to be valued more than family crests. In that context, those laying the intellectual foundations for society, from laws and religion to astronomy, were not kings or warriors, but scholars living in deep forests, the Druids. And to truly understand who they were, one must look at the environment that shaped them, the sacred woods, where knowledge, belief, and mystical fear blended into a unique ecosystem in human history. Those forests were unlike anything that exists today. They were not merely tangled trees with light flickering through the canopy. For the Celts, the forest was where the universe became most comprehensible, where wind, leaves, and sunlight carried messages from the divine, where every crack of a branch could signal a major event for the tribe. It was within this space that young druids were brought to begin a learning journey lasting over a decade, a journey many compared to entering a university where the final exam could appear at any moment in the form of a strange dream. No one truly joined the druids. They were chosen, or more accurately, drawn by the promise of knowledge beyond the limits of ordinary humans. A youth with keen observation, extraordinary memory, or strong intuition would be brought into the forest, where he would learn to read the sky, read water currents, read the intentions of neighboring tribes, and sometimes interpret signs that even he wasn't sure he fully understood. A druid's knowledge was not only broad, it was flexible in a way that no modern education could replicate. They understood crops like a farmer, laws like a judge, human psychology like a philosopher, and the night sky like an astronomer. With no written texts, all knowledge had to be stored in memory, a living database where any error could have real consequences: failed harvests, pointless wars, or botched rituals. But the most remarkable aspect was not the amount of knowledge, but how they absorbed it. A druid did not sit at a desk or take notes. They lived with knowledge. Every morning was a lesson in climate. Every sunset was a lesson in the movement of the stars. Every tribal dispute was practice in law and diplomacy. It was this blend of scholarship and daily life that created a power both subtle and absolute, the power of those who understood the fundamental workings of the world. And as with all valuable knowledge, it came at a cost. One who trained as a warrior could be exhausted physically. One who trained to become a druid was eroded mentally. Long months memorizing hundreds of cosmological poems, years living in isolation within ancient forests, ceremonies lasting until the sun rose and set twice, all shaped a person both extraordinary and distant. When they returned to the tribe after years of training, they walked differently. They spoke differently. They did not need to shout or brandish a sword to assert themselves. Their power lay in silence. The Celts believed a druid only needed to look at a person to know whether they were lying or telling the truth. Regardless of the truth, that belief made druids the most formidable social regulators without resorting to violence. Meanwhile, while soldiers forged steel and kings mapped territories, the druids did what no one else dared. They attempted to explain the world using logic before science existed, and intuition before religion was systematized. They did not merely predict weather, they observed climate across generations. They did not merely treat illnesses, they studied medicinal plants through careful experimentation over many generations. If an herb could relieve stomach pain but cause hallucinations, they remembered both facts and passed them on to the next generation, not through written texts, but through sacred oral rituals. The forests where druids trained were unlike anywhere else on Europe's mental map. They were lecture halls where life was analyzed through the language of nature. They were courts where disputes were resolved without bloodshed. They were temples where ancestral spirits were honored. And they were libraries, libraries without books, but filled with the memories of previous generations. It was this environment that created a system of knowledge able to endure for centuries without a state or holy text. As empires expanded and collapsed, as warriors rose and were replaced, as borders were redrawn to a point that people no longer knew where they belonged, the Druids remained, calm, unarmed, without thrones, yet regarded by the entire tribe as indispensable pillars. Yet their true power did not lie in prophecy or transmitting knowledge, but in helping humans understand themselves. In a world full of violence, where survival was sometimes the only reason to rise in the morning, the Druid provided what a warrior could not: the belief that life had order, that humans had purpose, that fate was not a random current, but part of a larger story. And perhaps it was this that made them legendary. Keepers of knowledge longer than empires, more enduring than oral traditions, and stronger than any kingdom. When the Gauls looked up at the sky, they did not see random points of light floating in meaningless emptiness. They saw the pivot of the entire world they lived in, a map of time, a scripture without words, a signaling system understood only by those trained meticulously. And in that moment, the role of a true druid began, not only to read what was happening, but to read what was about to happen. They were the only ones in the community capable of looking at a streak of light in the sky and knowing whether winter would come early or late, or understanding that a slight change in the moon's color could be a sign of a difficult planting year ahead. These observations were not spontaneous acts born from a sleepless night. They were the result of decades of persistent monitoring of the sky from places the Gauls believed where the boundary between the human world and the divine world was thinnest. Long, windy hilltops, ancient stone circles, open fields where the sun rose and set according to the mystical order they had memorized. Sometimes a young apprentice had to sit for hours by a river, watching the moon's reflection on the water just to determine the precise moment the light bent. It proved nothing to outsiders, but to a druid in training, it was the way the world revealed its rules. This is what made the Romans feel deeply unsettled: knowledge without written texts, power without a clear hierarchical system, and an intellectual class that seemed to hold the universe's code without relying on the tools Rome considered the foundation of civilization. For the Gauls, not recording knowledge was not a sign of backwardness. On the contrary, it was a statement that sacred knowledge could not be confined to human characters. It had to be alive, passed orally, understood through experience rather than writing. An apprentice could spend a lifetime learning what their teacher humbly called the first things. But Druid training did not stop at observing the sky. To become a true master, one had to learn to see the world as an interconnected whole. Tree roots, wind direction, rainy seasons, bird calls all contained information. A flower blooming late could signal a drought year. The scent of a storm could indicate a warning of a harsh winter. For the Gauls, nature was not just a background. It was teacher, library, court, and the site of all sacred activities. But only Druids knew how to read it. The early years of training were always the hardest. While other tribal apprentices learned to wield spears and shields, Druid apprentices learned to be silent. They listened, they observed, and most importantly, they learned to memorize a body of knowledge that would overwhelm anyone else in society to the point of fleeing into the deep forest just to scream. There were no scrolls to flip through, no tablets to consult. All had to exist in their minds, like a library of infinite volumes rolled into one. From that silence emerged one of the most important roles of the Druid, the tribal advisor. Remarkably, they did not advise through coercion. A Druid never stood up and demanded that villagers do something because I said so. They guided by pointing out balance between person and person, between clans, between humans and the natural world. When two clans had conflicts lasting years, they did not merely judge right or wrong. They investigated the root causes of the imbalance and what was needed to restore it. A Druid apprentice at this stage had to observe how their teachers handled the most complex disputes, from dividing water sources between herding tribes to broken oaths that could lead to war. They learned not to become lawyers, but to become living embodiments of the law, a rule unwritten but preserved in the collective memory of the people. Here, justice was not determined by argument but by consensus. A verdict was not given to punish, but to restore peace. And in many cases, that peace was more important than any penalty that could be imposed. Yet, not all Druid activities occurred in daylight. There were nights when apprentices followed their teachers into the forest in complete silence to perform rituals witnessed by only a few. These rituals were not performances, but full communication between the tangible and intangible worlds. Sacred bundles of leaves were burned not to create smoke, but to create a language, a system of symbols that only someone trained for many years could read. As the flames flickered in the wind, their teachers could speak of a favorable harvest or impending disaster, as if the world itself was communicating its fate through them. What mattered was that every ritual carried profound responsibility. A small mistake could alter the meaning. A timely prayer could save an entire village from a deadly winter. A neglected ritual could make the community believe they had lost the favor of the gods, a disaster the Gauls considered worse than war. For the apprentice, the greatest moment was not completing a sacred chant or memorizing a series of lunar cycles. It was realizing that the knowledge they were learning was not for themselves. It was to serve the community. That, when they became a bridge between the human world and the divine world, not through power, but through responsibility. And it was that responsibility that made them the most powerful spiritual force of the Gauls, surpassing warriors, kings, or tribal leaders. Because ultimately, when night fell and all torches were extinguished, only one thing guided the entire community: the belief that the Druid understood this world better than anyone else. When the power of Rome surged down like a flood of steel, the Druids did not dissolve as the Roman historians like to imagine. They did not vanish into the mist, nor did they fade into legend. Instead, they contracted, like a flame struck by a strong wind, but not extinguished. The large councils that once convened in the dense forests now shifted to smaller clearings, where only those truly devoted were present. The rituals once performed openly before the community became whispered acts under the canopy as the Druids continued their role, protecting the unseen yet indispensable elements of Gaul. It is easy to forget in tales of mighty empires that Rome did not shape everywhere it went. Sometimes it was the lands they conquered that shaped them. And in Gaul, what shaped them was the steadfastness of scholars without ink, but with memories longer than any Senate scroll. When laws banning druids were read in newly constructed squares, the people did not see Caesar as the savior he wished to be. They saw him as a visitor who did not understand the language of the land's spirit. Even when Rome built stone roads and military forts, the silence of the forests persisted like a challenge. The Druids knew that the more one imposed, the more culture needed a refuge. Therefore, they became that refuge themselves, living in the minds of the people, in folk songs, in stories around the fire, and in the way the Gauls viewed the world as a tightly interconnected web. Rome could forbid rituals, but it could not forbid belief. During this time, the role of the Druids changed. They no longer stood in the marketplace to lecture on cosmic order or mediate public disputes. They were now advisors in the shadows, sought by the people at night, crossing damp paths to ask for guidance, not because Roman law required it, but because their own souls demanded it. A mother seeking healing for her child, skeptical of Roman physicians, would turn to them. A warrior caught between duties to his tribe and new laws would consult them. A local leader, even after swearing loyalty to Rome, would secretly ask what the ancestors said about the empire's declarations of war. This was the moment the Druids' silent power reached its peak. Rome saw them only as stubborn priests, but the people saw them as compasses keeping Gaulish identity from drifting away. And it was precisely this mental stability that truly terrified Rome. You could burn a sanctuary, but you could not burn the idea that nature had a voice. You could destroy a council, but you could not destroy the habit of listening to the wind before making a decision. That was something Caesar could not crush between two fingers. To understand the Druids of this era, one must look at the young apprentices, forced to grow up in a world where everything they were taught was considered illegal. If previous generations learned under the sun on sacred hills, this generation learned under the forest canopy in silences longer than any lecture. And in that silence, knowledge took even deeper root. A young apprentice might spend months memorizing ancient genealogies, not to glorify the past, but to preserve something more important, the ability to recount a story Rome could not rewrite. They knew the Romans were skilled at rationalizing history. They knew that the story of Gaul could be distorted under Roman pens, but it could not be twisted in the living memory of a Druid. In a world where every word could be monitored, memory became the most fortified fortress. Their world was no longer grand councils, but secret networks, villagers hiding them, protecting them, sharing food, bringing them to safety when Roman patrols passed. That loyalty was not demanded by the Druids, it came from trust they had painstakingly built over generations. When a Druid offered advice, it was not merely guidance, it was the continuation of a tradition so long that the Gauls felt if they lost it, they would lose themselves. Their steadfastness had a dark side. Many were captured, interrogated, or exiled. But what Rome never anticipated was that this rigidity only enhanced their mystical aura. A forbidden philosophy is always stronger than an accepted one. When something is prohibited, it becomes purer, harder to destroy, and the Druids became symbols of resilience in silence, a force Rome could not measure in terms of victories. This period was also when they realized true power lay not in grand rituals, but in adaptability. Some councils began combining Druidic knowledge with Roman knowledge, not to submit, but to understand the enemy. Some young Druids learned Latin to decode edicts. Others studied Roman medicine to supplement their healing repertoire. This was not betrayal. It was evolution. They did not lose their identity. They made it stronger. By now, the Druids had become something Rome could never predict. Not merely priests, not merely scholars, not merely advisors, but embodiments of resistance to assimilation. They were the mind of a people, the collective memory of a culture, proof that sometimes enduring soft power surpasses any sword. Harold quickly realized that the Varangian Guard was not merely a prestigious troop. It was a forge where the fate of men rejected by their homelands was reforged through fire, oaths, and conspiracies that never slept. Constantinople did not care where you came from. The city only cared what you could do for it. And in Harold's case, the city saw a spear not yet honed to its fullest edge. Every morning, the clang of metal rang out in the marble training grounds, where warriors from frozen lands trained under the Mediterranean sun. The other Varangians saw Harold as a young giant still unversed in all the shadows of battle, but within a few weeks they began whispering to one another that he absorbs technique like others drink ale. From the way he held a Byzantine shield, lighter but demanding speed, to the spinning steps in the palace corridors while guarding the royal family, Harold learned quickly. He was also the first to arrive and the last to leave the training grounds each day, not out of fear of weakness, but because he understood that this was the final opportunity to redefine himself. A failed prince was worth nothing, but a warrior trained by the elite troops of the most powerful empire in the world, that was the first step toward becoming a legend. While many Varangians sought only gold and mead, Harold observed closely how the Byzantine court operated. The corridors where officials passed were silent as thin ice, but beneath the stone floors flowed hidden currents of power. Whispers during evening ceremonies, fleeting glances between two princes, secret meetings of nobles vying for influence. Harold did not understand all the invisible rules of the court, but he knew they existed, and he wanted to learn them as efficiently as he had learned to swing an axe. And so by day Harold fought, by night he learned. He studied Greek, a language as sweet as honey, but as sharp as steel when used in discourse. He learned how to the special belts of the palace guards, how to watch without staring at the emperor, how to read the expressions of ministers when they dared not speak their true thoughts. Each lesson was a piece of a puzzle. And Harold, the boy who had once wandered through the forests of Norway, now saw himself as a sword gradually being honed to brilliance. During this time, he also witnessed the dark side of the empire, a darkness no northern warrior was prepared to face. In grand religious ceremonies, Harold and the Varangian guard formed living walls while the emperor passed among the bowing rows. Yet sometimes, amid the hymns, he heard other sounds. A dagger hidden beneath a robe, the sharp breath of someone trying to suppress despair. Once, Harold discovered a young servant trembling in the corridor, hiding a piece of paper under his arm, a letter warning of a plot to assassinate the emperor. He delivered it to the Varangian commander, but what chilled Harold was not the plot itself, but the cold composure of the palace officials as they handled it. "Don't worry," one official said, "this happens here every month." Byzantium did not merely train Harold's physical strength, it taught him the fragility of power and how to seize it. Then, the first opportunity to prove himself arrived. A rebellion broke out on the frontier where tribes unwilling to pay taxes decided to test the emperor's patience. The Varangian Guard was mobilized, and Harold was sent to the battlefield for the first time under the banner of Constantinople. This was no longer the chaotic Viking skirmishes where shouts drowned out everything else. This was Byzantine warfare, disciplined, precise, each formation moving like a colossal machine. Harold stood at the front, shield heavy in hand, and for the first time felt the strength of an army that controlled chaos rather than being consumed by it. When the enemy ranks broke, he felt something surge in his chest, a sensation not just of victory, but of belonging. It was the moment Harold realized he was no longer a failed prince fleeing his homeland. He was on the path of someone who could shape his own destiny. Upon returning to Constantinople, his reputation began to spread through the Guard. They called him the North Star, the guiding star in battle. Some said he was stronger than 3 ordinary warriors combined. Stories even claimed that Harold could carry a wounded Byzantine soldier on his shoulders for miles without rest. Whether exaggerated or not, that renown drew attention. And in Byzantium, when you drew attention, you either rose or fell into the grave. But Harold did not seek fame alone. He sought something greater, a new identity, a rebirth. He understood that his fate no longer lay in the snow-covered mountains of Norway. That fate was being forged daily on the marble steps of Constantinople, in the emperor's gaze, and through every command he received in the Varangian Guard. It was then that a piece of intelligence reached him, a chance certain to change his life entirely. A royal mission, extremely important, dangerous, to the point that only the most trustworthy and incorruptible warriors would be chosen, and one of those warriors was Harold. Harold Hardrada stepped into a world where every sense had to remain alert, where a single misstep could bring consequences deadlier than a sharp sword. Constantinople, with its dazzling marble palaces, golden domes glittering under the sun, and mosaic lined corridors exuding an almost divine sense of power, was a stage Harold had never dared to imagine. Here, footsteps, glances, and even the rhythm of one's breath could be deciphered, becoming signals or warnings in a game of power where every participant understood that any mistake could end their life or reputation. For a boy who had once wandered through the cold forests and mountains of Norway, everything was both alien and enchanting, a challenge beyond any standard of courage he had ever known. Each day in the Varangian Guard was a new lesson in discipline, strategy, and survival. Harold learned to move through palace corridors like a shadow, silent yet formidable, always observing courtiers, officers, and even the lowest ranking officials to detect the slightest signs of betrayal or conspiracy. He learned to stand silently, hand on the haft of his axe, eyes scanning every corner, like a wolf quietly guarding its territory. It was not just physical strength Harold needed. He required intellect to anticipate dangerous moves before they became real threats. Here, the agility of the eye and sharpness of judgment became formidable weapons, more important than the heavy axe he carried on his shoulder. Learning did not stop at military discipline. Harold was captivated by the workings of the Byzantine court, where a single word could declare war, a gesture could decide life or death. He observed closed doors, secret meetings, fleeting glances between seasoned officials and palace servants, all forming pieces of a complex machine of power. He quickly realized that true strength did not lie in axes or shields, but in the ability to observe, evaluate, and act at the right moment in the right way. And Harold, with his innate northern instincts, learned so quickly that even senior officers were astonished. Then came the real challenges. Rebellions erupted in succession from Bulgaria to Sicily, from Asia Minor to the empire's distant frontiers. Regular Byzantine troops often hesitated, but the Varangian Guard and Harold at the forefront of the vanguard were seen as the last line of defense. Each deployment placed him before fortified strongholds, treacherous terrain, and enemies hidden in forests or mountain passes, where any mistake could lead to total failure. But Harold did not flinch. He charged into the battlefield with decisiveness, steadiness, and a combat rhythm so fast that insurgents often did not even realize what had hit them. Harold's preferred strategy, following Northern tradition, was relentless assault and maximum psychological pressure on the enemy. He believed that an opponent faced with overwhelming force and unceasing decisiveness would soon question their own chances of survival before collapsing. Byzantine officers were initially skeptical, but quickly recognized its effectiveness. Harold was strong not only in muscle, but in battlefield intellect. Every bold decision, every swift and precise attack helped him build a reputation across the empire, to the point where other northern warriors called him the North Star, a symbol of strength and discipline that commanded respect from both enemies and allies. What made Harold exceptional was not only tactics or strength. In Byzantium, loyalty was gold, and he understood that loyalty could not be faked. While many mercenaries sought only temporary reward or personal gain, Harold maintained his oath to Emperor Michael IV. This steadfastness earned him the responsibility of guarding royal treasuries, protecting important ceremonies, and even standing beside the throne during sensitive rituals. No one dared question him, and this loyalty became an indispensable part of the palace's power mechanism, an invisible shield maintaining the empire's stability. The campaigns Harold participated in tested not only physical strength, but intellect. Every fortress taken, every ambush navigated, every complex tactical plan demanded perfect coordination between northern warriors and Byzantine forces. Harold quickly learned to combine the raw strength of the north with Byzantine strategic sophistication, creating a combat model difficult for opponents to predict. He was the first to charge, the last to retreat, and often the one proposing daring strategies that astonished Byzantine commanders. With each victorious battle, Harold's renown spread further. Rebel soldiers whispered about the northern giant. Byzantine commanders trusted him not only for his strength, but also for his reliability and ability to handle emergencies. In an empire rife with intrigue and betrayal, Michael IV saw in Harold the one man worthy of absolute trust. Harold Hardrada's rise was no longer just a matter of battlefield achievements. It was proof of the intellect, loyalty, and extraordinary adaptability of a Norwegian exile boy, gradually transforming himself into a living legend at the heart of medieval power. Harold Hardrada was no longer a young guard who merely swung an axe in the marble corridors of Constantinople. In fact, he had become a symbol of strength, discipline, and intellect within the Varangian Guard. The task of guarding the royal treasury was not simply a duty, it was a test of loyalty, observation, and the ability to endure pressure. Anyone entrusted with supervising vaults filled with gold, artifacts, and diplomatic gifts had to be ungreedy, fearless, and capable of recognizing hidden dangers in every glance and gesture. Harold met all these standards and more. He transformed what seemed like a dry and dangerous job into a stepping stone for personal ambition and an extraordinary career. Every day in the vaults of Hagia Sophia was a lesson in power. Torchlight danced over golden chests, the glitter of crowns and precious vessels shimmered, and Harold stood there like a living statue, overseeing it all. He learned to read subtle signs, a servant's furtive movement, a greedy official's lingering gaze on a coin, or a fleeting tension in the voice of the inventory clerk. Everything could be a signal of conspiracy, and Harold, with absolute calm and focus, learned to turn vigilance into the most potent weapon. The challenges did not come only from within the palace. The royal treasure was a temptation, and temptation bred plots. A missing chest of coins could spark an investigation. A lost artifact could endanger a noble family, even threatening the stability of the entire court. Harold stood amid all this with silent confidence, as unmoved as stone, deterring the greedy and plotting from daring. It was this steadfastness and transparency that earned him the most important responsibility, protecting not just wealth, but the empire's prestige and power. By flickering torchlight in locked vaults, Harold realized an important truth. Treasure was not merely gold or valuables, but a symbol of power, influence, and control. Every chest he guarded, every artifact he supervised was part of the Byzantine machine of power. Through this, Harold gained an intuitive understanding of how empires measure strength, how power is reinforced not only by armies, but by wealth, by managing assets and influence. These experiences built a profound awareness of power, knowledge not everyone possessed, and it would become a spiritual weapon for Harold's future. But guarding the treasury was only the beginning. Harold's true career was tested in more distant places, where wealth, power, and war intertwined in a complex web of strategy and intrigue. Sicily, the sun-drenched Mediterranean island, was where he proved his real mettle. Here, local forces vied for influence among Greeks, Arabs, Lombards, and Normans. When a rebellion broke out, the Byzantines knew exactly whom to send, the Varangians, and among them Harold Hardrada, already famed as an unstoppable storm on the battlefield. The campaign in Sicily was the clearest demonstration of Harold's rare combination of physical strength, intelligent strategy, and leadership. Rebel fortresses perched on cliffs, protected by labyrinthine walls, with enemy forces ready to counterattack at any moment. Under the scorching sun, many soldiers grew weary, but Harold moved with certainty, calm to the point of ruthlessness, making the enemy falter before his power and decisiveness. He was not just a warrior, he was an organizer, a decision maker, and sometimes a risk taker to clear the way for his entire unit. Legends tell that Harold developed daring strategies, infiltrating harbors to destroy enemy supply lines, climbing cliffs under the cover of night to open gates. While Byzantine chronicles might recount this dryly, Norse sagas always emphasized his mythical strength. In every campaign, Harold's name was mentioned with respect, recognized not only by Byzantine commanders, but also by fellow soldiers for his extraordinary abilities. Victory in Sicily not only reinforced the empire's power, but also brought worthy rewards to Harold: gold, spoils, and growing influence. Yet for Harold, the most valuable was battlefield experience, political insight, and leadership skills. He learned to combine the raw strength of the North with Byzantine tactical sophistication, creating a model of combat that earned respect from both allies and enemies. Every fortress captured, every stronghold conquered, was a lesson in war, power, and how to become a true leader. After Sicily, as the empire turned eastward and provinces such as Syria, Palestine, and Jerusalem faced threats, Harold was again entrusted with expeditionary duties. There, amidst scorching deserts, swirling sands, and experienced enemy forces, he continued to demonstrate extraordinary adaptability. He learned to march farther with less water, fight in looser formations suited to open terrain, and maintain discipline in dangerous engagements. Every battle, every march, every negotiation was a precious lesson, strengthening the power, experience, and strategic vision Harold would carry for the rest of his life. The years spent in the vaults, on Sicilian fortresses, and on eastern battlefields transformed Harold Hardrada from an exiled teenager into an extraordinary warrior, blending northern strength, Byzantine tactics, and unprecedented leadership. He was no longer merely someone who swung an axe, but a living symbol of loyalty, intellect, and extraordinary resilience. A man ready to ascend the throne and leave an indelible mark on history. But for Harold Hardrada, the distant lands of the Levant were not merely a stage for mysterious intrigues or amorous temptations. They were a vivid battlefield where every step and every decision could determine destiny. After years under the shadow of Constantinople's golden vaults, through the fortresses of Sicily and the deserts of the Levant, he had learned to wield power in ways European warriors could never have imagined. Campaigns were not merely about moving troops or occupying strongholds. They were lessons in psychological control, in skillfully balancing raw strength with subtle cunning, in combining necessary ruthlessness with strategic patience. Every battle, whether in scorching sands or on perilous cliffs, honed Harold in ways no classroom or philosophy could teach. In Jerusalem, where Christian pilgrimages and Crusader knights converged, Harold realized that power came not only from weapons or tactics, but from the ability to observe, calculate, and anticipate the enemy's intentions. Young knights, raised in European castles with their codes of honor and ceremony, were often overwhelmed by the complexity of culturally rich Eastern cities, where language, customs, and fighting styles were unfamiliar. Harold, with his diverse experience, quickly understood that knowledge of people and culture was a more effective tool of power than any sword. His ability to read psychology, to discern opportunities from traps, made him a warrior not only physically strong but intellectually astute. Journeys across vast deserts with fierce sandstorms and extreme temperatures transformed Harold into a master of survival and combat. He learned to march farther with limited water, maintain discipline among soldiers under harsh conditions, and coordinate sudden attacks that caught enemies off guard. From protecting treasure-laden caravans to capturing key fortresses, Harold proved that strength was not merely overpowering the enemy with sword or axe, but controlling situations, exploiting weaknesses, and seizing opportunities. These skills, combined with the wealth he acquired during his time in the Varangian Guard, made him a figure capable of influencing and wielding power independently, even beyond Byzantium. Meanwhile, the Crusader knights, many stepping out of Western villages for the first time, timid and unfamiliar with the world, faced challenges they had never imagined. Levantine cities such as Antioch, Jerusalem, or Acre were not only vibrant with strange colors and scents, but also contained complex relationships, differing social rules, and Eastern women of beauty, power, and confidence that astonished and overwhelmed the knights. Some found comfort in these relationships amid long campaigns, hardships, and loneliness they could not share with comrades. Others saw pragmatic opportunities to bolster status or satisfy material and emotional needs. In any case, it was a completely new experience, very different from the moral theories, rituals, or vows they had learned in churches. In this context, cultural differences shaped life and combat. Eastern women not only knew how to care for themselves, but also managed businesses, inherited property, and participated in important community decisions. They were skillful communicators, astute in handling commercial matters, and often held significant social power compared to European women. For the Crusader Knights, this was both fascinating and perplexing. They had to learn how to interact with them, using gestures, gifts, and clever words, sometimes relying on interpreters, sometimes on charm and mutual respect. These relationships, whether discreet or public, sometimes strategic and sometimes genuine, taught Western warriors that the world was far more complex than they had imagined. While Latin priests preached that desire was a trap and chastity a sacred duty, the reality on the battlefield and in Levantine cities was entirely different. Basic human needs, loneliness, the desire for closeness, the need for sharing and comfort, could not be suppressed by sermons. Knights, despite being steeped in moral and honorable ideals, still sought connection, affection, and understanding across cultures. This was a lesson in humanity, in how power, emotion, and survival intertwined in the realms of war and diplomacy. For Harold, these experiences were not merely observation or challenge, but opportunities for learning. He saw how people operated in diverse environments, saw how wealth and power were shaped and protected, and how a warrior could simultaneously be a leader, strategist, and diplomat. Experience in the Levant perfected him as a complete military mind, ready to face any challenge from Northern Europe to Byzantium, from battlefield to palace. It was crucial preparation for a Harold Hardrada returning home no longer as an exiled youth, but as a king, a strategist, and a living symbol of strength, intellect, and courage. But while the relationships between knights and Levantine women provided comfort and stability, they also reflected the deepest inner conflicts of the Crusader soldiers. Under the blazing sun and scorching heat of the Levant, vows of chastity became more fragile than ever. A smile, a touch of the hand, or simply a kind inquiry could break the wall of spiritual discipline the church had built around them. While priests preached that desire was a trap and chastity a sacred duty, the reality the knights faced was entirely different. Loneliness, fear, and the pressures of war, things that could not be dispelled by sermons in classrooms or churches. The perceptive and subtle Eastern women quickly recognized these spiritual needs. They conversed, shared meals, and offered moments of comfort to warriors in a world full of danger. But these relationships were not merely flirtation or diversion. They carried significant risks. A knight caught in the arms of a local lover could face public punishment, humiliation before the troops, loss of title, or heavy fines. Priests warned that breaking a vow could weaken collective morale, disrupt military order, and lead to serious moral consequences. Yet, despite punishments and humiliation, many knights followed the path of their hearts. They sought comfort in a lover's embrace, in shared stories, in small but warm gestures amid the cramped life of camp tents and fierce battles. Even Crusader commanders, outwardly stern, sometimes quietly turned a blind eye. They understood that a soldier exhausted and lonely could not maintain fighting spirit without emotional support. A secret relationship, though against the rules, could be crucial in keeping the army stable and soldiers loyal. These relationships, from initial courtship to temporary marriages, gradually became part of the hidden social structure of Crusader communities in the Levant. In international cities such as Antioch, Jerusalem, or Tripoli, Latins had to learn to adapt to norms and customs they had never encountered in Europe. Temporary marriages were arranged not only for affection but also for practicality, protecting women and children, consolidating political power, forming alliances with local families, and ensuring stability for soldiers. A knight could enter an agreement he thought discreet, but the bride's family would consider him fully responsible legally and socially, forcing him to carefully consider every action. Many knights found lasting comfort in these marriages. In the harsh environment of constant warfare, a home, a caregiver, and a sense of belonging became an indispensable source of moral strength. These relationships were often nurtured through hardship, with sincere affection and growing mutual dependence. Yet alongside this, they also served as strategic tools. Eastern families, particularly Armenian and Syrian, saw an opportunity. A Latin ally brought protection, wealth, and prestige to their community. They were willing to participate in marriages, even actively arranging alliances to strengthen their status and safeguard their families during turbulent times. As Latin and Eastern women's relationships became more common, a new reality emerged. Children. Children born of Latin fathers and Eastern mothers became living evidence of cultural intermingling that the Western Church sought to deny. In the eyes of priests, this was a shame. In the eyes of crusaders and local families, it was an inseparable part of human reality. These children grew up in a bilingual environment, combining the customs, religions, and cultures of both sides. They became living bridges between two previously distant worlds, partly symbols of alliance, partly key political links in the new power structure of the Levant. Crusaders realized that survival could not rely solely on military might. They needed alliances, and alliances required marriage. A knight, once sworn to remain pure and chaste, now had to negotiate with Armenian, Syrian, or Greek noble families, becoming a valuable political pawn. These women brought dowries, local influence, strategic knowledge, and networking ability, all aiding Latin lords in consolidating power within Levantine cities. A Latin lord could arrive in Antioch as an outsider, but after marrying a local noblewoman, he became socially, economically, and militarily secure. These women were not merely caretakers or lovers, they were crucial links in the network of power, protection, and survival. From the Eastern community's perspective, these marriages brought stability and connection between old and new powers, creating an adaptable and flexible social structure. During this period, the parallel relationships of affection, politics, and power not only shaped personal life, but also profoundly impacted the political and social structure of Crusader states. Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, Jerusalem all witnessed the rise of powerful mixed families, where Latin blood merged with local traditions, producing a generation of leaders fluent in both cultures. They became translators, negotiators, and elite soldiers, connecting two previously alien worlds. But the complexity did not end there. When Crusader soldiers died or returned to Europe, many families were left vulnerable. Some women were protected by the community, others faced hardship, and the church rarely recognized these marriages. Yet, in these brief moments of history, these mixed families became proof of human resilience, of the ability to forge connections across cultural and religious boundaries. They were living evidence that even amid the brutal crusades, humanity still sought to bind together and maintain love, stability, and hope for the next generation. But even in the chaotic world of the Crusader states, where swords and vows shaped human fate, love and ambition still found their own path. As Latin knights began to build new lives in Antioch, Jerusalem, or Tripoli, they faced not only war, famine, and disease, but also the subtle and difficult realities of Eastern social life. Local women, from Armenian and Syrian nobility to ordinary Greek or Arab girls, became decisive actors in this network of power. A smile, a gentle gesture, or the ability to understand a Crusader warrior's spiritual needs became more important than any military strategy, as they were what could keep a soldier's heart steadfast in the face of death and overwhelming loneliness. The relationships between knights and Eastern women initially often arose from emotional needs and comfort. A soldier, after months of marching and fighting, who saw a girl offering him a hot meal, a warm home, or a kind word, would realize that true strength lay not only in sword or armor, that this closeness, though brief or silent, carried latent political power. When a Latin knight grew close to an Armenian or Syrian lady, he inadvertently became part of a power network that the Western Church tried to control, but could never fully dominate. Many hoped their daughters could Latinize the knights, adjusting the behavior and habits of foreign men to fit Western ways. Some succeeded, but many failed miserably. Minor scandals quickly escalated, for the Latin Church never accepted marriages that were not approved, especially when the woman adhered to a different faith or was entirely unfamiliar with Western Christianity. Priests would scold and accuse Eastern women of bewitching crusaders, pulling them away from Latin tradition, where clerical sermons and customs were considered the standard. Yet, contrary to this outrage, many Latin nobles openly praised their Eastern wives or lovers, admiring their intelligence, loyalty, political acumen, and social sophistication, qualities often lacking in the Latin Church itself. The result was a profound cultural fusion. Latin castles gradually became decorated with a blend of European and Levantine architecture. Meals mixed Western bread with Eastern spices, creating flavors both familiar and exotic. Children born from mixed marriages were raised multilingual, learning to inherit thrones or political roles in both cultures. Observing the Crusader states in this period, one no longer saw a copy of Europe, but a new world, shaped by a subtle combination of tradition and survival, power and affection. These relationships also carried significant risks. A Latin knight could go from being a foreign soldier to a local lord through marriage to an Eastern noblewoman, but could also create unforeseen political instability. If relationships were mishandled, scandal, jealousy, and power struggles could erupt. Courts in Antioch or Jerusalem often resembled Byzantine stages, where power, honor, desire, and greed intertwined. A seemingly simple romance could break fragile alliances, leading to conflicts among nobles, bishops, and military leaders. Love in this environment was not merely personal, it was political strategy. A noblewoman with a close relationship to a knight could significantly elevate his influence, but only if matters were handled discreetly. If scandal spread, the consequences could be disputes, alliance failures, or even civil war. Jealousy and competition among knights further complicated matters. Some commanders firmly refused to cooperate with those whose relationships threatened the army, while kings had to adjust policies to maintain order in the court. Yet notably, despite all efforts at control by the Latin Church, living reality followed its own human logic. Knights continued to maintain families, care for lovers, and raise children. Roman clergy were outraged, but enforcement of rules was nearly impossible. Armies were dispersed, cities depended on local cooperation, and many commanders quietly understood that a knight with a stable family, even unofficially, would fight more effectively than a lonely, melancholic, and anxious man. Public condemnation existed alongside private tolerance. Rebukes from the pulpit could not stop genuine affection, and it was precisely this affection that shaped an unprecedented hybrid society. Over time, the Crusader states developed a blended culture where Western values and Eastern practicalities intertwined. Love, ambition, and the drive to survive created alliances stronger than legal documents or strict doctrines. Mixed families became cultural bridges, resolving disputes, guiding newcomers through Levantine customs, and building diplomatic relationships that armies and policies alone could never achieve. In every street of Antioch or Jerusalem, one could see the image of a completely different society. Children speaking both Old French and Arabic, houses combining Latin crosses with Levantine art, kitchens filled with blended flavors, architecture both European and Eastern. Above all, it was the emotional relationships, marriages condemned by the church, and mixed families that shaped this new social face, creating a world where love and survival were stronger than any sermon or treaty.